Join us for our upcoming fundraiser, A Feast for the Senses, at Ardmore Music Hall on September 29th to help HRN expand our table and provide even more resources to the next generation of food storytellers. This is going to be an unforgettable night of flavors, crafted by Best of Philly chefs Randy Rucker and Eli Collins, with sounds curated by Philly-based Spaga, featuring Aaron Magner, and conversations inspired by Delicious City Philly host Eli Kulp. You can find tickets at heritageradionetwork.org/feast. And if you can't make it to our fundraiser, please consider donating to support our education programs at heritageradionetwork.org/donate.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything. West Home is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Learn more at westhome.com.
This is Capri Cafaro, host of Eat Your Heartland Out. This week, we are taking a trip back in time to two farms that offer immersive historic culinary experiences. First, we'll visit Connor Prairie, where historic interpreters bring yesterday's cooking skills to modern-day students. Then it's off to the team at Living History Farms in Iowa, who run several dinners that reflect authentic experiences of community members from days gone by. Sarah, thank you for joining Eat Your Heartland Out.
I am very excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. So first things first, what is Connor Prairie and what can visitors find there?
I describe Connor Prairie as a living history museum. We're a little concerned about using the word museum because that can kind of discourage some people. But we have so much more than a museum. We have an animal encounters area where you can be up close and personal with some of the animals and some of the baby animals. We have the original house that belonged to William Connor, built in 1817, and you're able to go through that house. We have a Lenape area for Native Americans that were in this area. We have a loom house where we do reproduction, spinning, dyeing, and weaving. We have a nature area and what we also call a treetop, which is an outside tree house that's, I think it's 4 levels high, but there's lots of things that are out there that you're able to do in the wooded area, and a lot of good things for hands-on for children to do. And then, of course, there is our pioneer area, is what often people refer to it as, but it is a Prairie Town is the name of it, an 1836 village, and you can walk from house to house and engage with people in costume who are attempting to do first-person interpretation. So they are talking as if they actually live there. They're doing the chores and the activities and the skills and the trades that are of the time period. And, of course, we have cooking and using the historic receipts, as we call them. We know those today as recipes.
Well, there's a ton to do there and so much to learn. And I guess that's why Connor Prairie is, I believe, the first Smithsonian affiliate in Indiana, right?
It sure is.
That's pretty impressive.
Yes, it is. And we're excited about it.
Well, and you know, I know you mentioned at the beginning that this is, I guess, the historic land of, not only Indigenous people, but then obviously later on was owned by, I guess, William Connor. Give us like a 50,000 foot level, like Cliff Notes version of just a snapshot into the history of Connor Prairie.
The history of Connor Prairie, this is actually the 50th year for our Prairie Town area. So we're quite excited with that, and we're having the 50 commitments that are being done throughout the year in order to celebrate the 50th anniversary. But prior to Connor Prairie, I'm actually working backwards. It was the land had been purchased by Eli Lilly, who I think most people are probably familiar with the Lilly pharmaceutical company.
Pharmaceuticals, yeah.
And he was very, I think, encouraged or impressed by Williamsburg and other museums, and he kind of wanted his own little Williamsburg. And so he did purchase the land. He restored the house, and I believe it was back in 1934, that he restored the house. And so there were lots of activities that went on during that time, and we do have some black and white video of that, which is kind of fun to look at. Prior to that, it was actually sitting idle. Going back even into the late 1800s, it was lived in by different families. Sometimes they were people who were working on the land for Mr. Connor. But as I mentioned, the house was built in 1817 and was built for his second wife. And it's a big, beautiful brick home. It's called an I form, or it's shaped in the I with a central hallway and 2 rooms, one on each side, and up on the second level, same thing there. There is a kitchen in the back that has a beautiful beehive oven. Great big, beautiful hearth, one that you can't stand up in, but you can certainly get into. And there's also a garret above that, which may have been for the person who was cooking for the family, or it could have been used for storage. Some of those things are kind of hard to tell unless there are very specific records written to that effect.
Well, speaking of records, your receipts or recipes are definitely a guide to how you develop the food waste programs there. And you are one of the historic interpreters working, both in textiles and in food waste. This is a food show, so we're going to talk about food waste predominantly. So you really immerse yourself in the role of, being that interpreter and transporting those of us who visit in the 21st century back in time. So tell us about your food waste programs and maybe more specifically, how you develop and do the research to bring those kind of experiences to life.
All right. We have lots of food waste types of programs. I'm going to begin with the Hearthside dinners that you mentioned before. It is probably one of our favorite, as far as those who are cooks, programs to do. It is the hardest work you'd ever love, because you are working from 12 noon till about 11 at night and on your feet most of that entire time. According to the Board of Health, of course, the major part of the meal has to be prepared in an approved area. Then there are more simple items like the bread, like the butter, like a vegetable side dish of potato eggs. Maybe they're making some kind of a sauce. And when those are done up in the Connor house with the guests, they actually are making what they're going to be eating. But it is only for 12 people a night, and it is by reservation. And the time with the interpreters is typically from about 6 until 9. And so for those 3 hours, we are on the floor talking in first person, answering questions. We do straddle a timeline a little bit, but then we always slip back, take a step back, and move back into 1830s. But it is all done by candlelight, by the fire, and we have games that take place in order for us to clear the table and reset it with dessert. But it's a beautiful, beautiful evening. We also have programs such as our History on Tap, which takes place usually the first weekend in June. And that is one where we have brewers and some wineries in the area, quite a few of them, I should add, that come and will serve tasting glasses to guests. And of course, that is ticket sales. And so we have a beautiful cob oven, which is, I think it's about 7 years old this year, that another girl and I built at that time. And it is amazing to use. And so we were approved by the Board of Health to use that to make pretzel bites. So we make small pretzels that, what else is better with beer than a salty pretzel,
Absolutely.
and maybe with garlic butter on top of that. So we have those available. People come by and they will stand in a long line just to get a pretzel bite. There's also another program of Chautauqua that one of our ladies is in charge of, and she often has tasting things there. She is extremely talented and oftentimes has made alcoholic beverages for the guests to partake in, as well as they have wonderful speakers that come and talk to a small group of people. Then, let's see, I think I'll go ahead and talk a little about what we do on a daily basis.
Well, I'm hoping that you're going to talk about the classes that you all do.
I'll go there next.
I'm always one that's looking to learn. And obviously this is an immersive learning experience at every turn, but there are classes that you can sign up and take and on a number of different things, including, foodways. I see here German strudel, bread baking in the wood-fired oven, dairy making, and it's soft cheese. I mean, this sounds like so much fun. So tell us about these classes.
Those classes take place primarily in June through October, mostly because of weather. And things like the cob oven are outside, so we have to be able to go out to access that. So in the brutal cold winter, we don't want to. We are looking at expanding the program to having a class every month next year. And some of those would be taking place inside, for example, in the Connor house at the big, beautiful hearth there with the beehive oven. So what we're trying to do is create a list of classes that we can rotate and do every 3 years so that people always have something to look forward to that's a little different. And then if they decide they'd like to come back that fourth year for a repeat in a class or one that they didn't take, 3 years ago, those will be available at that time. But we've done pickling classes, as you said, the cob oven, the dairying, I should call it the 19th century dairying. And once the soft cheese is made, they were going to make that into a pretty little cheesecake, which is a recipe that we had. Then the German strudel was a huge success, and they did both inside at the hearth and they also did outside at the cob oven. Then we have coming up the end of October, and I just found out a few minutes ago that the class is already full, but in the Connor house in the beautiful hearth, we will do an entire meal with 2 meats, 2 vegetables, 2 breads, 2 desserts, and then everyone sits down to partake. So they all learn how to read the old receipts or recipes. We also have them in a translated version, so it's more sensible to today's cooks. And then we don't have to stay in first person there. So we're talking about methods. We're talking about how many coals to put underneath a bake oven or a Dutch oven, how many to put on top, because a lot of times manufacturers will say put 11 briquettes. Well, we're not using briquettes. We're using coals from the actual fire. So we try to get a nice range of foods. And I think when you get 2 of everything, that table is full of food and people never go away hungry.
I can only imagine. Now, I want to dig into these receipts. The receipts, or as you said, as we know them as recipes today, but back in the 1830s, they would be referred to as receipts. How do you choose these recipes, and then how, if at all, do you adapt them to today's methods as well as maybe even taste buds if that's necessary?
When we are doing the old receipts, we are looking for items that we can use seasonality-wise, because we do have beautiful gardens and we have lots of produce coming in, especially now. In our interpretation, we also talk about preserving. And since we're open a few days during the winter months, usually Thursday through Sunday, we are also cooking on those days. So we're trying to use some of the preserved items that we've done. So lots of pickles, pickled asparagus, pickled radish seed pods, pickled carrots, pickled beans, of course, pickled gherkins or pickled cucumbers, pickled nasturtium seed pods, all sorts of things. And we're finding those in old period cookbooks. And I think what is exciting to us is that we don't have to have the book in hand because of that wonderful device called a computer that we can access so many things. It's wonderful that libraries are taking cookbooks and putting those available to view in entirety on the computer. Sometimes universities have an actual journal of a lady who has handwritten all of her recipes and put them into a book. And then they have photographs of those that you can enlarge, but then you have to interpret. Many of the recipes written in the time period are maybe 1, 2, 3 sentences, and they go on for a long, half a page. And so it's a matter of the more you read, the more you experiment, the more you try, the better you understand. A lot of cookbooks were written with the understanding that you knew that needed to be added, so it's not written down that you should add it. Things like when you're going to simmer something in a pot, it's not telling you to put water in the bottom because they assume that you know that. Or if you're cooking a rhubarb pie, put in a few tablespoons of flour because otherwise it'll be nothing more than soup. But they assume that you know that. So as we are reading the old recipes, oftentimes they're using weight measurements instead of cups and tablespoons and teaspoons, which is what modern cooks are familiar with. So we have found a way that we want to be able to share with our public, but also help our newer cooks to learn to interpret those recipes. So we began by printing out on an 8x11 sheet of paper, usually in Lucinda calligraphy, the recipe as it is written, and we give it reference to the cookbook and to the author. And if it is prior to our time period, we will put the date. We do extend our dates up about 15 years because we know that those things were often being made, but were not yet put into cookbooks.
Right. And just to remind our listeners, what exactly is your time period?
Our time period is 1836, and it's specific to that year.
Okay. And why? Why 1836 specifically as opposed to 1837 or 1835?
In 1837, there is a huge depression and everything fell apart. Absolutely everything fell apart. 1836 is a very normal, nothing exciting, nothing unusual year. And so it's easy for us to demonstrate, to explain and talk about everyday life without having those other influences.
Sure, that makes sense.
And we can still talk about things that have happened in history prior to. We'll talk about the Revolutionary War, the War for Independence. We will talk about the 1816 summer with no the year with no summer is what I should call it, because it snowed out in New York about 10 to 12 inches, I think. And so it killed all the crops. So we're able to talk about those things and how they influence what we would have to do living in that time period. So 1836 was one that they chose, and that's the one that we stay with. Then let's see, when we're talking about the meals that we're doing, pork is king in Indiana. And so there's a lot of pork. We have chicken after the 4th of July because those pullets are finally large enough to butcher. We don't have rabbit until winter months because you don't want rabbit fever. So there's just lots of things that will influence what we choose. We're not making our short beers until the hops are ready, and they're just now coming on. I can make a hops and potato water yeast to use for bread, which gives the taste that people are familiar with of a bread that has a very strong beer taste, because they used to use the barm at the top of the beer being made or the emptyins at the bottom. And so they're familiar with that taste. We have ways that we can preserve that yeast during the summer months by mixing in lots of cornmeal in order to make little cakes that we can then reconstitute.
And so all of these type of methods are these methods that, and the seasonality aspects, when you talk about rabbit and the chickens, I mean, are these things that are not only seasonal for today, but seasonal a la 1836? Like, I mean, obviously, if, for example, poultry is being commercially processed, it's not, there's a rhythm to that, but we can obviously get chickens 365 days a year at the grocery store, right? So if you're saying, well, we're only getting the chickens after the 4th of July, that sounds to me like that there's a historic significance to that context.
Yes, and that historic reference is to the small chicks that were born early in the spring are not large enough yet to butcher. We will have a chicken for our Christmas dinner because it is a very special treat to butcher one of your laying hens. Otherwise, we're not going to have any chicken much past probably September, the late end of September.
Now, I have to ask, because obviously you are so knowledgeable and you are, have been working in this context as an interpreter for a very long time. If someone were to come into contact with you, I mean, I would love to hear maybe some stories that maybe you've held on to interacting with folks that are visitors to Conner Prairie, that may be asking you questions and maybe are not really totally understanding that you can't maybe talk to them as present day or you're in character, and how that unfolds.
It's interesting how food connects with everyone, even if they don't speak the same language. That one of the things when I'm back in the kitchen and people make their way into the kitchen, especially with gentlemen, I love to say, "Oh, I see you followed your nose and you made it to the kitchen." And they just laugh and they say, "I always do." There's something about the smell of food, the smell of fire that everybody wants to find where it is and to find what's being made. When we're talking about food, one of the things I like to do with the recipes, the receipts that I told you about, is I invite people to make an image of my receipt if you would like to do that. In other words, I'm offering them to take a picture with their phone so that they can take that recipe home and give it a try. Because almost every single person wants to know, can I taste it? And if they don't ask that, they will say, what happens to your food when you've made it? So as Mrs. Zimmerman, I can say my family will be eating it, or there are several people in town who came down early today with their Spanish silver to pay for a meal. So they will be coming down shortly to have that meal. And there are times people walk in actually seeing those people sitting in the dining room eating and having conversation that's in 1836 style. If people have a question that they really want to know something in the present day, I have found it's very frustrating for people not to get an answer. So what I will often do is I will say, I will join you in your time for just a moment to answer your question, and then I will step back. And so I answer their question, and then I literally take a step back and let them know I'm in 1836. That way they understand that they got the answer they wanted, but I still need to return to my time period.
Right. How cool. This has to be so much fun. How much do you enjoy your job?
Oh, so very, very much. It's hard work. And on a day like today, when we have 100-degree heat index,
Yes.
or on those days where it's blustery, cold winter, snowing, it still is a wonderful, wonderful job. I love teaching, and I was a teacher in my previous life. And so I think perhaps that's the reason that I feel like I can share with people, but I don't have to hold them accountable and I don't have to test them. If you want to stand and talk to me for 30 minutes, which I've had people do, I will be right there with you. If you only want to step in and look and smell and step out the door, I'm sorry, you're going to miss so much more if you would just talk with me. But I respect the fact that that's maybe uncomfortable for you. So I will not step on your toes, so to speak.
Sure, sure. But you find ways to connect 1836 to the present. And as you said, food is this universal language that, even if you are being transported back to 1836, there's something that resonates with the people in their experience in 2024, literally and figuratively.
Yes. One of my favorite things to do, especially with young children, sometimes parents are not engaged until their children are engaged. Or the parents might be a little unsure how to react with you. And so if there's a child there, I often will engage with the child because then the parent can be comfortable. They're watching their child so they know that they're safe and they know that their child is getting some attention. So what I'll do is I'll ask them what their favorite food is to eat. And so often, of course, it's something sweet. So I invite them, may I teach you a receipt? You would know that word is a recipe. And they'll shake their heads, and some of them, they're so excited. I'll say, do you know your numbers? 1, 2, 3, 4. Absolutely, they do. And they hold up 4 fingers. So we go over a cupcake receipt, which is 1 cup of butter, 2 cups of sugar, 3 cups of flour, 4 eggs. Mix well together, bake a moderate heat for 40 minutes. But you can extend that, and you can talk about how it goes together and how to remember it, and then have them repeat it back to you. And I tell you, I have had more young people return to me at Conner Prairie and say, I tried that recipe, and you're right, it was so good. And the second time I did it, and the third time I did it. So it really has become a favorite. And it's something that, again, you make that connection. And you're connecting with kids. What better way to have them come up learning to love history?
Absolutely. That's so heartwarming. And I think a great place to end our conversation today. What you do is so fun, so inspiring, and so educational in a way that is just really different, and it's wonderful that you all are doing that work. So thank you so much for taking the time to explain to us how we can come and visit you in 1836.
And I do hope you all come to visit. It's a wonderful place to work. It's a wonderful place to visit. And thank you for asking me to join you.
And before I let you go, if people want to learn more, where can they learn more about you online?
ConnerPrairie.org.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you. And that's CONNER.
Yes,
Prairie,
it is.
Right? ConnerPrairie.org. Thank you so much. Everybody, check it out. It sounds like it's really well worth a visit.
Yes, it is indeed.
This is Eat Your Heartland Out with me, Capri Cafaro. After the break, I'm heading to Living History Farms in Iowa.
In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme looks after a sweeping stretch of territory from Brisbane to Darwin, with a climate as varied as the landscape. Wet seasons in the summer, dry seasons in between, every few hundred miles a different terrain, from lush wetlands and grassy plains to watering holes and ancient rocky land features. Westholme raises Wagyu beef, but there's a saying around Westholme that the real job is to grow grass, meaning that if they take care of the land, the rest will take care of itself. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is found only in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. The result is signature Australian Wagyu, built on a genetic lineage tracing back to Japan, imbued with the terroir of this changing landscape, and a flavor that complements every cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more and experience the difference for yourself at westhome.com.
Welcome back to Eat Your Heartland Out. I'm your host, Capri Cafaro. Before the break, I was speaking with Sarah Wintrow, a historic interpreter working in textiles and foodways at Conner Prairie in Indiana. Sarah shared how she and the team at Conner Prairie help educate today's visitors about yesterday's food traditions through cooking classes and events. Over in Iowa, similar programs are held at Living History Farms. I had a chance to speak to Elizabeth Cedril, the Director of Marketing and Communications, as well as Janet Dennis, Co-Director of Programming with a focus on foodways at Living History Farms. Elizabeth and Janet gave me insight into how they develop their history-themed dinners at the farm. Here's our conversation.
Elizabeth and Janet, welcome to Eat Your Heartland Out. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules.
Oh, you're welcome. We're really happy to talk about our programs.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, I want to start with you. Tell our audience a little bit about what Living History Farms does there in Iowa.
Living History Farms is an interactive outdoor museum with a mission to connect all peoples to the many stories of Midwestern rural heritage. We have been here since 1970, which means we're not only a reflection of Iowa's history, but in some ways a part of Iowa's history too.
Mm-hmm. How has it changed since 1970?
There's much more here than there was in 1970. We have, over the years, had some historic buildings that have been moved to our historic town. The general store, the law office were actually buildings that were the center of trades in other Iowa towns that were moved here. We've also constructed some buildings to reflect buildings at the time. We have a 1900 farmhouse and a 19th century barn that were both moved here to this site. And we have two historic buildings that have been here all along, but a lot more has been either acquired or built here since we opened for visitors to really immerse themselves in separate eras of Iowa's past.
Mm. Now, speaking of immersing yourself, one of those experiences is, a number of the experiences are related to food. Food is an incredible way to connect back to history and to tell the story of place. At least that's how I feel about things. And I know there's a number of different types of programs that you do there. Tell us a little bit about the variety of food-related programs that you have there at Living History Farms.
We have many demonstrations going on for general visitors during our regular season, but in terms of being able to either sit down and enjoy a meal or actually get your hands on cooking methods of the past, those generally happen in our off season, which is November through April. And we do dinners at 3 of our historic homes. They're all very distinct from each other, and Janet can provide some details about what they offer, how they differ from each other. And then we also have cooking classes, and these classes are also done at our historic sites. So people are cooking over an open fire, an open hearth, or a wood stove.
How cool. I mean, that definitely sounds like something I would love to do. And I'm sure people, are attracted to being able to come out and experience this for themselves. So Janet, you are the co-director of programming specifically for Foodways. And as Elizabeth just said, there's both these immersive dinners as well as cooking classes. How do these two experiences differ, and what could someone expect if they came for, let's start with the dinners.
For our dinners, we think of it as hosting guests in our own home. It's meant to be something that's very welcoming. Folks get to sit down in the house and experience the kerosene lamplight. They get to chat. They're a little more relaxed, and they get to eat. When they visit us during the summer, they get to watch us cook. But at a historic dinner, they actually get to eat what we cook. And we find that they relax and they actually chat with each other. They may be seated at a table with people they've just met, but by the time they leave, they're all good friends and they're exchanging emails because they've told stories and talked about how nostalgic that experience of eating together is.
It is something that we miss, I feel like, in our daily lives and in our modern worlds right now, that we miss that connectivity around the table. It's great that you all are recreating that. And I know you have 3 different types of experiences there that vary in the kind of, let's say, culture that is presented in each one of those three. Break that down for us.
Our oldest dinner program is the one that happens at our 19 era horse-powered farm. And there it's that quintessential little white farmhouse. Folks are invited to sit down at a table next to our big cook stove, and they're eating meat and potatoes and pie, mashed potatoes and gravy, things that are very farm oriented. And so we kind of describe it like going to see your grandmother on Sunday, where she has all of the family in and she set the table for you to sit and chat. The dinners at our 1876 Tangen house are just a little bit more fussy. We talk about going to see your great aunt who doesn't get to see you very often, so she got out her good china. And there you're seated at a dining table with lamplight, but it's a little bit more of a presentation where there's a bill of fare next to your plate. The napkins are folded a little fussier, but it is still a family style dinner. And then after that meal, you go into the Victorian parlor and you have a chance to play Victorian parlor games.
Oh, fun.
And relax a little bit before you go back in for dessert. The last house that we serve at is the Flynn Mansion, and that is our historic house here at the farms. It was actually built on our site. The 1900 farmhouse is historic, but it was actually moved to our site. So the Flynn Mansion is our personal farmhouse, but it is a 15-room farmhouse. It was built on a very high scale. So there we like to talk about how someone who has just come into money, like the Flynns did in the 1860s and 1870s, the kind of meal they might present to impress new business acquaintances or to impress new friends coming to entertain, to prove that they belong in that society. And it gives folks a taste of what it would be like to be waited on, which for down home Iowans is sometimes a little disconcerting. So we find we spend a lot of time at that dinner saying, it's okay, you use whatever fork you want, but we'll tell you what we think you should be using. Right. And just making people comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be so interesting to be able to kind of live like folks lived in these different kind of contexts, different economic status, different types of dining experiences. Like you said, your great aunt that's a little bit fussier, so maybe the nice china is out, and then, all the way to the mansion where, you have people waiting on you. What kind of historic research goes into identifying and curating the kind of experience that is delivered? Because I'm sure you're drawing from the historical record in order to recreate it.
When we start our research for new menus, we are often looking at diaries or party accounts just to see what people say they ate. And for especially our fall meals, when we look at Thanksgiving and Christmas at some of our diaries, folks talk about going to a turkey roast, where if you were entertaining, even at a farmhouse scale, for a special occasion, you were going to put a roast bird on that table if you could. So from diaries and letters, then we go into historic cookbooks. And that includes things that were published as well as family written cookbooks. We serve a bread recipe at the 1900 farm and at the Tangen house that was given to us by an Iowa family who can document it into the 19th century as being handed down. But we also look at published cookbooks from that time period, both published here in the Midwest and published in a greater span, because we know that women were getting cookbooks that were published on the East Coast, or even things that they inherited that were English cookbooks. So we start with that type of research. One of our favorite Midwestern cookbooks was actually published in the 1870s by the Presbyterian Women's Church Foundation. And so we know that those are American recipes that were used because they were submitted by home cooks. But we also look at cookbooks published by an author in England called Isabella Beeton, who was sort of the Martha Stewart style guru of her time period. And we know that that was published from London into American publishers and was still something that you could get as a housewife in the Midwest. So we choose from a variety of those types of cookbooks. And then from a table setting standpoint, we are looking at the Sears and Roebuck catalog to find out what kind of table linen is available. What could we put on the table for decoration at the Flynn House? Harper's and those types of women's magazines will suggest what you should have in your centerpieces. So we get to gather a lot of interesting information.
Oh, I bet. How long does it take to prep for a season? Do you recycle the kind of things that you do year on year, or do you refresh them?
We do a little bit of both. There are some favorite recipes that are returning dinner guests. If we don't serve them, they're like, well, why didn't we get scalloped potatoes this year? Or why didn't we get chocolate cake? So some things have to stay on the menu just because they're very associated with our dinners. But then we also like to try new vegetables and challenge our guests' tastes just a little bit. When we do our planning, sometimes I like to think of we serve one safe vegetable and one challenging vegetable. So you might have a green bean recipe or a carrot recipe that we're sure people will eat, but then we might throw baked beets onto the list, and not everybody's sure about something like that.
Yeah. How does that get received when you're, kind of going out of people's comfort zones?
We do encourage people to try everything. We remind them we're not offended if they don't eat everything on their plate. And then we're always surprised at how many people go, oh, well, I didn't realize I liked carrot soup. Or, well, I might try that at home. That's a great way to serve cauliflower.
Awesome. You can't hope for anything more than to, have people kind of expand their horizons a little bit. This brings up a good point, though, because I'm curious about the ingredients. How do you find, do you find that the ingredients that are listed in, whether it's the, published cookbooks or diaries, are they using the ingredients that we would use today, like you said, like carrots and green beans? Or are there some things that are a bit more obscure and dated? And do you still incorporate those into the menus?
It is a challenge for us if we have our historian hat on, where we want to be as period correct in what might go on a table as possible, because a modern palate doesn't really lend itself to everything a Victorian farm wife might have put on her table.
Right.
A good example is organ meat. We do several different dressing recipes, and folks are always like, does this have chicken liver in it? I don't do that. So we have to be kind of choosy with some of those types of things. For a very fancy meal, it was not unusual to have calf's head on your table. And
oh, wow.
It's hard for us to get, and most people won't eat it. So we have to be judicious in how period we are compared to what we know a modern palate will eat.
So what about, so there's no calf's head, but do you talk about the calf's head and say, well, at this time for these kind of special occasions, there might be a calf's head here, but we recognize in the 21st century, people are not necessarily putting calves heads on the menu?
Absolutely. One of our stories that we tell when we serve soup at the Flynn Mansion, it's a coursed meal. A very favorite soup for that time period would be mock turtle. And we like to talk about how terrapin in the East Coast were almost hunted to extinction for this soup. So they had to find a different way to make turtle. And often that was with calf's head or veal. And
interesting.
It's an interesting way to make people realize that there was an impact on the environment in the 19th century from even trying to serve duck at a fancy meal.
I bet that makes people reflect on how things get to their table even today, and what kind of impact that has on the future. Walk me through, if you can, just briefly, maybe in each one of the three experiences, what a typical menu might be.
For the 1900 era farm, we really like to focus on basic meat and potato recipes that are incorporating some things that would have been grown on the farm with a few things that they would have purchased. So with that meal, we're doing meat and potatoes, usually roast pork or roast chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, or we have a scallop potato recipe with a lot of butter and cream in it.
Yum, yum.
And then we pick vegetables that would be canned at home and then used during the winter. Then we usually do preserves and pickles that would show up on your table almost every meal for a farmer in 1900. Then our special ingredient there is usually chocolate cake, because cocoa was still something that was a little expensive at the turn of the century. But then we talk about comparing that with a fruit pie, which would be so common on the table that it wouldn't even be impressive in 1900. Your guests would just assume there would be pie because everybody made pie. And it's interesting to see guests' faces when they're like, but I slave over pie in 2024.
Right.
So for that meal, we try and be very farm forward. For the Tangenhaus, that is actually representing a family living in a small town. And there we like to talk about how this family, if they're going to throw a special occasion for even family members, if it's Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter, where they're going to seek out some things that would not necessarily have been made locally, that they would have had train access to get. So there we can highlight extra spices and those types of things. For the Flynn Mansion, we very much do that. And we talk about how the Flynns, if they were throwing a coursed meal, are going to be expected to have things that are not local on their table. But Mr. Flynn is also a farmer. He's raising shorthorn cattle and Berkshire hogs that he's going to want to show off. So he may be choosing his roast meat from something that's going to show off his farming skill and the quality of his animal.
Oh, interesting. So it really is a spectrum of different types of experiences, which is so cool. What about the cooking classes? What are people experiencing with that? And are they in these homes as well, or are they someplace else on the farm?
We do cooking classes at several different kitchens on the property. So we do have cooking classes at our Tangenhaus in our historic kitchen. We have had classes at the 1900 farm, but with that set of programming, we will also have hearth cooking classes in the log house at our 1850 farm and over an open hearth at our 1700 Iowa site. So you actually get some other experiences with those as well. And our cooking classes are usually very subject oriented. So it's either a bread baking class, or we're making pie or pastry. So they often have a focus on either an ingredient or a technique. And the interesting thing with the classes, as we offer them, we do have folks who are coming because they want to learn to make bread. But we often find that many of those students could actually outcook us, but they want the experience of cooking in a historic way. Right. And being with other people who enjoy food. We have a lot of moms and daughters, or grandmas and daughters and granddaughters who come together. I've had husband and wives who want to come to spend time together in a kitchen.
It's definitely something that we would sign up for sure. It sounds so amazing. I don't know. I'm excited about it. I feel like it's so unique. Elizabeth, I want to bring you back into the conversation briefly. How do you see, kind of with the bigger picture of Living History Farms, how do these foodways programs play into the larger mission of the farm?
Our mission is really to help educate people about the past, create connections to the past by letting them envision themselves in those eras. And so when we talk about the dinners and the classes, it becomes a much more individualized and detailed experience. These dinners, the maximum we could seat would be between 12 at the smaller homes and 18 for a tea at the Flynn Mansion. And the classes, because they're at historic sites, we will only register up to 6 people at a time. So there's individual attention. There's a lot of chance to ask questions and make the experience very much tailored to the guests or the students who are there.
Who teaches these classes, and how do they get trained on something that is so niche?
These are our historic interpreters, people on our staff, and I'm going to let Janet explain how they get trained.
For our classes, we do lots of hands-on training with our interpreters. Many of us are home cooks and enjoy cooking, but we have to learn to use a wood stove here. So there's lots of on-site training. So when you come to visit our museum and watch us demonstrate during the summer, that's kind of when we're practicing our dinners menus and when we're learning new techniques that we can then share in the fall. I have a new cook. Both she and I have not had a lot of experience with sourdough recipes, for instance. So this season and over the winter, we are personally practicing them so that then we can share that information in classes, hopefully next spring and next fall. So it's a lot of shadowing and trial and error.
I can bet that it's a lot of trial and error because these are different, it's not like somebody from, 1900 is going to be able to teach you and and you could apprentice it. There's a lot of drawing, I'm sure, from historic documents and, trying to navigate this on your own to make it as authentic as possible. Janet, how does it work when, so many of these historic cookbooks don't have, measurements or, put it in the oven at 350 degrees, because of course that wasn't a thing. How does that work, taking those historic recipes and making them function for today?
We do a lot of practicing before we put it on our dinner table. As we're looking at recipes, we think of vegetables that we want on the table or techniques that we want to showcase, like fricasseing or curry. And then we look at the recipe and make sure that we understand what it is we're trying to end up with. Because often the cookbook is not trying to teach you to cook, it's just giving you something new to cook. So their suggestion may be enough milk to make a batter because they think you know what a batter looks like.
Right.
So sometimes we don't always know what we're supposed to end up with. And so tweaking that can be a challenge. And we do share recipes at our dinners. And we want to make sure that that person who's sitting at our table can go home and go shopping at their local grocery store. So we will translate butter the size of an egg into 2 ounces or
Right.
2 tablespoons or 3 cans so that they can stand in their grocery store and go, I don't know what this means. And make it a little easier to translate. So there is a lot of experimenting along the way.
Yeah, I've had my own experiences with that, trying to cook from historic recipes at home, particularly baking, and it can be a real challenge of trial and error. So I had to ask about that. This is just such an exciting thing that all of you do. If people want to visit, whether they want to take a class and enjoy a dinner, or maybe even, we have a teacher listening that might want to bring their school group out, how would they be able to learn more about Living History Farms, Elizabeth?
Information about all of our programs, including links to register for them, is on our website. That is LHF, as in Living History Farms, LHF.org. And we've got descriptions of the foodways programs as well as other programs. And we would love to see your listeners out here.
Well, count me in. I'm like, I say this, I feel like I get to meet so many incredible people through speaking to guests on this program. And I'm like ready to get in my car and start driving west to Iowa from Ohio because this is just so up my alley. And I'm sure it is, exciting to, so many of our listeners as well. So Elizabeth, Janet, thank you for taking the time to share a little bit about Living History Farms and the foodways programs there.
Thank you. We really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
You've been listening to Eat Your Heartland Out. This episode was produced by me, Capri Cafaro. Our audio engineers are Liam Warner and Armin Spengen. Theme music by Jason Shaw. You can learn more about the show by visiting heritageradionetwork.org/Eat Your Heartland Out. Eat Your Heartland Out is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.